Tonight is a program that is part of what we hope will be a series of presentations by people who have come to do research on Sears Island over the last few years. They've come up with some interesting projects, and this is the first time we'll have such a presentation. For those of you who are not familiar, Friends of Sears Island is an all-volunteer, not-for-profit organization that is the land management entity for Sears Island. And we have about a 640-acre conservation area on the island, and you can see the picture of the island aerial over my shoulder here. That is wild and free at the moment. A portion of the island is also reserved for possible future use by the Department of Transportation for a port of some sort. Some of you will know well uh, um, that there has been an effort to uh, develop a wind port, a port where giant floating wind turbines would be built for launching and deployment in the Gulf of Maine to generate energy as a part of Maine's renewable energy efforts. That effort for the right now seems to be moribund. It's at least sleeping, but there's always the possibility of a development and on the island, and that's something we're watching for and concerned about. Uh, I want to say that as a volunteer not-for-profit, we are supported and receive lots of donations every year from hundreds of individuals and a number of local and regional businesses that we're very grateful for. If you are a donor, thank you so much. If you're not, I'd certainly invite you to go to friendsofsearsisland.org and consider making a donation. Those of you who are on our list will receive our annual campaign letter in hopefully a few weeks, where we'll ask you to help us support the work that we do there. Um, as I said, we have had a number of students and other people coming to the island to do research, and it's been very interesting to learn about their projects. Tonight, for the first time, Jula Moll-Roček is presenting on their findings regarding fungi on Sears Island, also known as wasumkik. And again, for the uninitiated, wasumkik is the Penobscot word that's what they've called the island traditionally. But this is the spelling and the pronunciation that has been offered by Penobscot Language Keeper. For many years, it was anglicized as Wasumkeg, with a different spelling, but this is what we're using now as advised by our friends in the Penobscot Nation. And so, without further ado, let me introduce Eula, and uh, you can introduce yourself and give whatever background you'd like, and then let's get into it. I should say we'll ask for questions at the end. We'll try to have you ask them directly. If that gets a little out of hand, we may have to mute and have to put them in the chat. But I think let's try to keep this informal. It's not a huge group. We have 16 people right here, and hopefully we can handle questions at the end. So Eula, the table is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Rolf. And yeah, to Friends of Sears Island for hosting this and allowing me to do this research. So my name is Jula Moll-Roček. I have a background in evolutionary biology. I have a bachelor's from many years ago from Harvard. At that time, I studied mostly forest ecology. And then somewhere along the way in the last 8 years or so, I got really interested in fungi again. I grew up foraging for mushrooms with my Czech grandmother. The Roček part of my name is Czech. And so it was kind of a coming back to a childhood fascination. But yeah, tonight's talk, I'll be sharing about some research that we did last summer with my friend Jay Echeverria. Um, and let's get into it. Let's see. Okay. So just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about, kind of a um, contextualization of fungal ecology and why should we even care about mushrooms and fungi. Maybe just to define those terms, fungi is a broader category that includes little guys like yeasts and other things that don't produce fleshy fruiting bodies, which are the mushrooms themselves are the reproductive organ of a subset of fungi, like these bright red ones, Frost bolete, you can see here on the right. And yeah, so we'll talk about fungal ecology and why they matter in ecosystems. Then we'll get into some more details about fungal conservation, and there's a framework called the three Fs, referring to flora, fauna, and funga. Um, and then we'll zoom in to talk about the context of Sears Island, Wasumkeek, which Rolf just introduced really nicely, and what previous work has been done on fungi on Sears Island, which, spoiler, there's not a whole lot. Um, then we'll describe the methods of what we did, the results of what we found. Then I'll have a series of slides that just show some nice pictures of some of the fungi that we found, and then a brief discussion of what might come next. Yeah, so fungal ecology. Why should we care about fungi? I want to start off with this quote by Merlin Sheldrake, who's the author of Entangled Life, which is a really wonderful book if you're interested in this topic. Um, he's just a beautiful writer and scientist. And he wrote, Mycelium is ecological connective tissue, a living seam by which much of life is stitched into relation. And here to illustrate that on the top right photo, I have a picture of some oyster mushroom mycelium. So those individual strands are called hyphae, and collectively they're known as mycelium. And this is something I just have growing in my kitchen in a little glass jar on some spent coffee grounds. And what you're seeing there is the body of the fungus, essentially. So it's, yeah, growing out in this concentric circle from a little piece of inoculated sawdust that I mixed in with the coffee grounds. And so most part of what has made studying fungi difficult is that mostly they're very cryptic and hard to find because most of their life is spent as these tiny, essentially microscopic threads that are interwoven through the soil or through rotting wood, as we see in the bottom left. Those are fruiting bodies, sulfur tufts emerging from a rotting piece of wood and decaying that wood. Um, so yeah, fungi are fundamental to ecosystem health and nutrient cycling, and they perform a couple different functions in ecosystems. We'll start with the saprotrophs or saprophytes. So those are decaying dead organic matter. That can be wood or leaves or even further decaying compost like the common button mushroom or portobello mushrooms that we eat are actually grown on compost. So there's a whole succession of decomposers that arises. And yeah, the sulfur tuft Hyphiloma fasciculare is an example of that. And that's really important for releasing those nutrients back into the ecosystem and kind of the little story that people tell emphasizing how important this is if these guys weren't breaking down organic matter, we would be drowning in dead wood and dead leaves. Um, and then we have a very important group that I've clustered as plant symbionts. Some that have been receiving a little more attention recently are the mycorrhizae. So that word comes from myco, referring like mycology, referring to mushroom, and rhizae, referring to roots. So these are mushroom root associations. And there's a this is a very superficial overview just to get us grounded in the context, but mycorrhizae are really important for most land plants, and they extend the surface area that roots can access for nutrients by a lot. You can see how thin those hyphae are. So imagine that weaving through soils. And in exchange, they're receiving sugars from the plant host. And this is actually also a really important function for regarding climate change because a lot of that carbon is being stored in the soil through that mechanism of plants pumping sugars to their mycorrhizal partners. Then we have endophytes. So endo referring to within and phyte plant. So mycorrhizae are kind of you can think of them as a subset of endophytes. But basically all plant tissue is hosting some kind of fungal or many kinds of fungal life. And endophytes are basically those fungi that live within plant tissue, whether that's leaves or stems or bark or wood or roots that don't cause some kind of disease. Because as we'll see in a moment, fungi are also responsible for most plant pathogens. Um, oops, I skipped this. The Wood Wide Web is kind of an overall name given to the network of mycorrhizal networks that is present in soils, because an individual tree can have dozens of fungal mycorrhizal partners, and each fungus can be linked into multiple trees. So you get this incredibly complex web or network of fungal threads. Um, yeah, stitching together the soils and ecosystem. Um, so it's also worth mentioning that all of these categories are kind of human constructs placed on top of complex biology, and these are actually more like spectra that sometimes Sometimes a fungus will live part of its life as an endophyte inside a leaf, and then when fall comes around and the leaf falls and it lands on the soil, then it'll switch to its saprotrophic lifestyle and start breaking down that leaf. And it's basically benefiting from that kind of first seat at the table of being there first and being able to establish itself before other microorganisms can. Then we have parasites and pathogens. As I mentioned, let's say 90% of plant pathogens are fungal in nature. So bacteria and viruses are a much smaller portion. And there's some really catastrophic ones that we might be familiar with, like the chestnut blight or the Dutch elm disease, things that have really dramatically reshaped our eastern forests. Um, but those are, yeah, these are important. You can also think of them kind of as predator-prey relationships. So they might be keeping ecosystems in balance in other cases. Yeah. And so the mushroom here on the bottom right, the jack-o'-lantern, which is actually a bioluminescent mushroom and one that unfortunately some novice foragers confuse for chanterelles because it's big and bright and orange and exciting, but um, it is a weak parasite on the heartwood of oak trees. Um, and yeah, then I included these truffles because I think they're really cool. Ecologically, for the most part, truffles are mycorrhizal, but they're a modification of the fleshy stapping cap and stem fruiting body, where basically the spore dispersing surface, which are the gills on a normal cap and stem agaric mushroom, has become enclosed, and the whole thing has kind of retreated underground where it has stable humidity and stable temperature, which is great for keeping it around for a while, but now it has this problem of how to disperse its spores because it can't just drop them into air currents. And so truffles, which have evolved upwards of 40 different times separately, so it's a very successful lifestyle, um, use aroma basically to attract predominantly mammals to eat them and then poop and deposit the spores in other places. So this gives you a little overview of how interwoven through all of our forest ecosystems fungi are. Fungal conservation and the three Fs. So there's flora, fauna, and funga. So fungi are a whole distinct kingdom of life that was only recognized as distinct from plants, which they were used to be categorized as in 1969. But they're actually more closely related to animals than to plants. They have cell walls made of chitin, the same protein that insects have for their exoskeletons. And they also can't produce their own food, so they don't photosynthesize. They have to get their carbon from outside. Um, so I want to bring your attention to the figure here. If I can find my mouse. Okay, that doesn't seem to be working. So on the bottom left of the figure, we have a tiny little lion, and the size of these images is corresponds to the number of estimated species in that group of organisms. So vertebrate animals is a very small group, less than 100,000 species. Um, all plants, including mosses and algae, is less than 500,000 species. And then we have this big cap and stem mushroom. Fungi are estimated somewhere between 2 and the highest estimates are 10 million, but it's probably closer to 2.5 million fungal species in the on Earth. And then we have this gigantic ant on the right, representing the roughly 8.5 million estimated insect species or invertebrates. Um, and then the number in black underneath that represents how many of those species have been described by science. And you'll notice that fungi, it's only about 5% that have been described and in contrast with plant species where we have roughly 90% estimated to have been described. Um, and yeah, that reflects both cultural and historical biases as well as it's harder to collect fungi and they're more ephemeral. Um, So the three F's framework is basically incorporating the language of this word funga into existing conservation frameworks, which already recognize flora and fauna as important biodiversity that needs to be conserved. And funga is a neologism. It's not real Latin, but it just works really nicely for that framework. And so there's this organization, the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and has the red list, which is kind of globally the authoritative list of what species are threatened, what species are close to going extinct, what needs to be conserved, it's our way of prioritizing conservation goals. And it includes almost 170,000 species, um, 47,000 of which are threatened with extinction, but only 130, excuse me, 1,300 fungal species have been assessed at all, and 411 of those have been um, are recognized as being at risk of extinction. Um, so you can see fungi are both understudied, and we still have a long way to go in just describing what's out there, and also um, underrepresented in our conservation goals. And there's a wonderful organization called Fungi Foundation, or Fungi and fungi is interchangeable, depends who you ask. Um, Fungi Foundation, which is based in Chile. And so they have passed legislation in Chile and in the UK to incorporate fungi into their conservation framework. So there's some work being done on this. Okay, zooming in to Sears Island with some key. Um, the whole island has roughly 940 acres, making it one of the largest undeveloped islands on the East Coast. It's quite ecologically diverse. It has at least 11 different ecosystem types that were recognized by a natural resource inventory done a couple of years ago. And as Rolf mentioned, about a third of the island is owned by the Maine Department of Transportation, and there's been a string of different infrastructure projects that have been planned and uh, thwarted thus far. Um, and those have, yeah. It is, I would say, a biodiversity hotspot. That's not following any specific scientific definition, but it has two vernal pools. It's located at the mouth of the Penobscot River. So it's in this kind of estuary habitat. It has, so on the image here on the top right, you'll see this little blip of pink that's coastal dune grasslands that the state of Maine recognizes as rare and threatened. And the other jigsaw pieces of color there represent those 11 different types of ecosystems found on the island. Um, yeah, it's it's a special place, as many of you know better than I do. Previous work on fungi on Sears Island. So there are two documents that I referred to as kind of ecological background um, literature for Sears Island specifically. There's a natural resource inventory, and there's a Sears Island Joint Use Planning Committee document. Neither of them mentions fungi at all, which isn't surprising given our conservation frameworks that are lacking that third F. There's been very little collecting or documenting of fungi on the island. Um, Herbaria are these institutions that house basically dried plant, or in this case, fungus samples, which are the basis of how species are named and defined. So I like to describe them as libraries of life. They're usually not very public-facing institutions, but they're incredibly important for our understanding of biology. Um, so in Herbaria, prior to this project, there was only one fungus documented from Sears Island, and that was a single lichen that is held at the University of Tennessee Herbarium. I don't know the story of how it got there. Um, The Maine Mycological Association carried out a single day foray in September of 2012 and found 93 species of fungi. Um, and this is a picture from Sears Island. No, this is Earth. Yes, this is from Sears Island. Sorry. And I just wanted to show this as a little aside. So I learned this fungus as Tricheptum biforme. It's the violet tooth polypore. It's a saprotroph, a fairly common wood rotting fungus that has this beautiful purple edge. But taxonomy and nomenclature in mycology is constantly in flux. And so just 2 years ago, it changed names and is now known as Palidoherschioporus biformis. Um, so the way to read these scientific names on the left is the italicized, that's the genus and species, and then there's data about who first described it and then who most recently described it and the year. Um, so the methods of what we did, um, the heart of the project was a series of field surveys that we carried out from June to September of 2024. And we used this app that I highly recommend if you're interested in biodiversity called iNaturalist. This is a screenshot from iNaturalist. The pink dots indicate where we were collecting. So each dot corresponds to a collection that was made, and then you can have a series of pictures. It's a really handy way of keeping all your data together, and also it gets uploaded to a general database that can be shared with other folks. If you want, you can make them private, but it's great for sharing. Um, so yeah, we basically collected um, as many fungi as we could on these excursions. And then we dehydrated those and did our best to identify and label them. And everything we found was deposited at the Farlow Herbarium at Harvard University. So that institution is holding these. It's one of the major herbaria in North America, and so that's kind of a really useful source of information for future research. And the final thing that we did was in collaboration with Pete Avis at UMaine Orono, we took a series of soil samples and he did environmental DNA sequencing, so testing for anything from little fragments of hyphae to spores to actual living hyphae, and testing those for DNA sequences to identify them to species as best as we could. And here's what we found. We had 101 specimens collected, which represented 57 families, 78 genera, and 93 species. Um, all of those specimens are accessioned at the Farlow Herbarium. Um, and we sampled 16 sites with the soil sampling protocol, and the sequencing there returned approximately 64 genera and 89 species. Um, and yeah, so the bottom right is the field survey team with Jay Echeverria, um, and my 2-year-old at the time, Misho, who accompanied us on that day. And actually, young children are spectacular fungi finders because they're right up by the ground and um, like to notice things. So there's a number of specimens that are there because of Misho. Um, on the bottom left is an example of an earth ball, and you can see this little fungal diversity survey sheet that we used while we were collecting. Um, and so it's close, it's similar to a puffball, but develops a little bit differently and cracks open when the spores are mature, and then generally rain or some other disturbance will spread the spores. In the top left, we have the gray-veiled Amanita porphyria, um, which is a member of this genus Amanita you may have heard of. That is the genus of fungi that contains the most deadly um, fungi out there. They have a toxin called amatoxin that basically dissolves your liver over the course of a couple days. Um, and then on the top right is Hypomyces hyalinus, which is a mold that attacks Amanita mushrooms and pretty much deforms them. If you've ever heard of the lobster mushroom, that is a different type of Hypomyces that attacks a different mushroom, and that makes a good edible. I don't recommend trying this one, but I thought they were interesting, and it shows just how intricate some of these ecological relationships are. Okay, we got to the show and tell portion. Um, this is the Viscid Violet Court, which is just a lovely color. Cortinarius iodes, described back in 1853. And this one is mycorrhizal and generally associates with oak trees, which is, I think, something that makes Wasamkeep kind of cool. Is it's relatively far north and still has some pretty large oak trees. Um, I don't know how much further up the coast you find oaks, but maybe other folks do. Um, then we have a heath waxcap, Gliophorus laetus. Um, This one is described in a field guide as a mediocre edible. I personally don't have any experience with this one. And then just to showcase some of the different forms of fungi, this is best guess, this is the orange coral or Ramariopsis crocea, which unusual for coral mushrooms, which tend to have these intricate shapes, is actually a saprophyte. Most of them are mycorrhizal, but there was a lot of this out when we were collecting. And then on the other side of fungal architecture, there's the brown tooth crust fungus, Hydnoporia olivacea, which just forms this little brown crust on the bark of the twig that it's rotting. And this is an important wood decay fungus. This was growing on an oak branch. Um, some of these things, you can see why they would get overlooked. This is a scaly vase chanterelle or Turbinellus flacosus. Um, it is usually in the English language field guides that I've seen, it's usually listed as inedible, but it is consumed and even sold in markets locally in parts of Mexico. So some of edibility is also just a cultural preference. Sometimes it's just about what textures we like, and um, but yeah, this is a good edible. This is the flame-colored chanterelle, Craterellus ignicolor. Um, yeah, some of these did not make it into the herbarium. This one is the destroying angel. So this is one of those Amanita species that I mentioned earlier that is deadly poisonous. And these are really impressive mushrooms when you find them. They're generally quite large and just strikingly white. And I actually remember when my grandmother, when I was a kid learning to forage, when my grandmother pointed out one of these for the first time, and just kind of the awe and fearful respect that the mushroom commanded when I was told that it was not to be touched because it would kill me. Which is like you can handle you can touch any mushroom but don't ingest the ones that are dangerous. Okay, so where does this leave us? I think if folks are visiting Sears Island and have an interest in using iNaturalist, continuing to build up a database showing the biodiversity that's out there, kind of part of the thinking behind this project to begin with was like this could eventually maybe become some line of evidence in arguing for the need to conserve the island. So I think that's something that anyone with a smartphone could contribute to if they're interested. There is an existing project on iNaturalist called The Animals and Plants of Sears Island, and I would love it if someone could figure out a way to add fungi to that name and just start applying the 3Fs framework just locally. I was poking around and unable to figure it out, so maybe someone who's a little more tech savvy can figure that out. Um, And then I encourage people who are interested to harvest sustainably. For the most part, my reading of the literature shows that unless you're actively disturbing the mycelium, picking mushrooms is not going to have any detrimental impact on the mushrooms. Um, And then there's the ongoing campaign for Sears Island. You can visit their website at protectsearsisland.org. They're pushing some Maine state legislature to try and conserve the island. And I had a brief email exchange with Chris prior to this. So I know they're still working on things and they're planning to revamp their website and things are in the works. But yeah, just want to take a moment to thank Friends of Sears Island again. I want to thank Professor Don Feaster for supporting this work, my friend and co-conspirator Jay Echeverria, and Dr. Pete Avis for their collaboration. And yeah, I think we can open it up to questions.
Great. Well, Eula, thank you very much. I know as a complete I love to eat mushrooms and cook with them, but I don't know anything about it, and I'm really fascinated to hear more about how integral they are with plants and animals. This is new information for me. And you mentioned the campaign to protect Sears Island, Wassumpkick, and I should hasten to mention that Friends of Sears Island, being a 501(c)(3) not-for-profit organization, we're not really able to take an advocacy role in terms of any sort of political activity. So that, for example, the effort to work towards the conservation of the entire island, it's ongoing by others. We're actively monitoring, and some of our members, many of our members are also parts of the activist group. But we as an organization are not able to take the leadership in that effort. So just to be clear, we're certainly supportive of that, but not able to take a leadership role. And I guess if you don't mind, I would just start by asking, I'll start off the questions by saying, how is there a way to articulate the relative importance of fungi, in the Sears Island natural environment when you talk about wetlands, for instance, or vernal pools?
Mhm.
You mentioned taking on this as a potential new and important factor to discuss. How can we fit that into some sort of hierarchy, or even just a general discussion of the importance of protecting? I did notice on your map that many of your samples are taken in the island that on the part of the island that is not under conservation. So that's very interesting to me as well.
Um, let's see. So your question is how to kind
How
of,
to talk about the relative importance of fungi with all the other natural features that are more well known and prominent. As I
yeah,
said,
I mean, in some ways it's part of this bigger kind of issue of trying to raise awareness around that fungi exist, that they're not all scary and poisonous. Some of them are, but that's really the minority. Um, and that they're an important that they play an important ecological function. I think I mean, there's some really great media out there, like the Fantastic Fungi documentary that was out a couple years ago does a really wonderful job of kind of inspiring that awe
okay,
and appreciation. Yeah.
good. Well, that's fine. I guess let's open it up. If you have a question you'd like to ask, feel free to unmute yourself and go for it. I'm not seeing a bunch of unmuting going on. I hope I'm not wrong. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi. Um, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi.
Yes, it's a
I'm curious. Uh, I'm curious about. I know I'm in school for ecology. I know a little bit about fungus, but I don't know a lot about like these coastal areas. I mean, like I imagine, like everywhere else, it plays a role in like the soil health of coastal areas. But like I don't know really about and I don't know if you know like how it impacts like the larger ecosystem around like erosion and I don't know. I don't know anything about coastal fungus really.
Yeah, I don't know specifically the fungi that are kind of specialized into like areas that are getting exposed to salt water more frequently. Certainly, like you mentioned, they play a role in stabilizing soils. And I've just been reading, this is a little bit tangential, but I've just been reading a lot about after burns. They're really important in kind of holding things in place so that soils don't just erode. And then this is again something I really would like to learn more about, but there's a whole world of marine fungi that they're not filamentous, so they're not forming those little threads, but there's a whole world of like if we take a step back, we remember life comes from these primordial soup thing, like all life emerges from oceans historically. So that's true for fungi too. So there's these marine fungi, and those are important in marine nutrient cycling too. I wish Pete were here. He could speak to that a lot more cogently. Um,
So that's super cool. I didn't know any of that. And I'm really glad you brought up iNaturalist actually, because one of my questions was gonna be if there was like a way that people who wanted to, participate via citizen science could contribute, and that's really good to know. I didn't know there was a group for Sears Island, so that's really good to know.
yeah,
Yeah, I think it is too. It could be something that we could promote even more among our constituency.
That mm-hmm.
Yep.
the specific project of plants and animals on Sears Island, I haven't been able to add my observations to it, but if you just make a box and search on the map for Sears Island, you'll see everything, not specifically that project. So it's all there.
Right, anything you make public, right, theoretically will show up on that map
Right,
if you just search it.
exactly.
Eula, I just wanted to say I really appreciated your presentation, and I didn't know that there was a group on iNaturalist for the plants and animals of Sears Island. I had no idea, which I have used iNaturalist before. So That's good information. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that I was there on the island with the Maine Mycological Society or Association, I don't, whatever. Anyway, it was amazing because, you talked about how many species were collected and everything. Well, they put them all out on this long table on the causeway,
Mhm.
and it was incredible to me. I mean, I do pay attention to fungi. I look at them, I photograph them. I don't know a whole lot about it, even though I've taken a couple of workshops. But I just think they're aesthetically incredibly um, pleasing. But
Yeah.
anyway, I was blown away to see what they collected. And I mean, in some of these sort of shelf fungi that were, like 2 feet in diameter and gorgeous, like turkey tails and things like that. Anyway, it really got me thinking about how important that fungi was and is on Sears Island, because there's so many varieties. And this year was not a great year for any kind of fungi on the island, I must say. And we
Yeah.
were going to have a mushroom walk, and decided against it just because, there just weren't that many out there because it was so dry for so long. But anyway, I just think it's nice to know what's happening out there. And you're right, a lot of, you don't see, unless you're looking for them too. A lot of them they're unnoticed. And I used to go mushroom hunting with my father and my grandfather, actually, and we were always looking for morels, whatever. I mean, we called them, yellow sponge mushrooms and black sponge mushrooms. And, my mother would soak them in water and everything, whatever, to supposedly get out little bugs. And then, saute them in butter, and put them on steak or something else. But my father loved taking me mushroom hunting because, just like you said, he said, you can find all these mushrooms that we wouldn't have found, And I was really little when we did this. But anyway, I'll shut up. But it's just, I think I just really appreciate them, and I'm glad that you were doing research out there and that you've shared your research with us.
Yeah. I'm glad it's worked out.
Are there other questions or comments for Jula?
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I didn't know much about Sears Island, and I'm glad that this is an opportunity to learn more about it. The geography itself, it looks like there is a causeway that leads to the island, and then there is a swath, a straight line bisecting the island. Could you tell us something more about that? How did that come about?
Sure. As Eula has said, and there have been 50 years of efforts to develop some sort of port or industrial project on Sears Island. So that line you see going up I call it the spine of the island. It actually goes straight up and then it curves to the right. It's called the Jetty Road, and it terminates at the shore on the western side. And the causeway was built back in the late 80s and early 90s to facilitate a proposed port. But again, as Eula said, all these projects that have been proposed, and I think there have been 8 or 10 anyway, from a nuclear power plant to aluminum smelting to natural gas storage tanks, to just a simple deep water cargo port. But all those projects had been stifled in the permitting process. They were not allowed to go forward. But the causeway and that road you see, was built with a very heavy truck in mind. So it is paved about a mile and a half up there, and then it turns into a dirt road. But it was done with the idea that it would be infrastructure for a port. It's still there, and in terms of use, is actually technically part of the land that is conserved, or it's not under conservation. It is by the DOT. And I should even expand and say that the state of Maine owns the entire island. The conservation area is held by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. DOT is essentially the state's representative in terms of managing this particular asset. And so in terms of the conservation area, there is this sort of triangular relationship with the DOT being the state representative, Maine Coast Heritage Trust holding the easement, and Friends of Sears Island serves as the land management entity, which means we're basically responsible for managing keeping the access to it open and free to the public, keeping the trails safe, ensuring that the terms of the conservation easement are not violated by any structures being built out there or other inappropriate behavior or usage. So that's a bit of background. Hope that. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a follow-up. I'm so happy to hear that the island has survived so many previous attempts to develop it in various ways. And I'm hoping that the offshore wind project also does not go forward, because that's something I think will impact the island and impact the fisheries and so many other things. So I'm very happy that the island has been spared of all of these attempts to use it in various ways that would impact it negatively. I have a question also for Jula. Jula, the various ecosystem types that you described, 11 of them, how many were you able to study during your visit?
That's a great question. If I were to do this over again, we would have been a little more systematic about visiting all of the different ecosystem types. I mean, we certainly collected in like open mixed forest, in more dense spruce forest. We collected in some sphagnum moss areas. We collected in some of these bracken fern areas. I would guess somewhere around 5 or 6 of the different types, but that wasn't specifically something we were tracking or planning our outings around.
Okay. Are you?
Ari, I'm curious to know where you're participating from. Are you a local or regional person, or?
I am from Massachusetts.
Okay.
I am BMC, Boston Mycology Club member, and I know Jula very well.
Good.
And this is this island has sparked my curiosity, because my wife and I would love to visit the island as well.
Please do.
Yes, I look forward to it. I'm very interested in endophytes that Jula previously spoke about. They're kind of cryptic fungal society that does not these are species that kind of difficult to ascertain their identity because they're in association with other living things, including other fungi. So this is a particular interest of mine as well.
Good. Are there any other questions? We're approaching an hour here. Not that we have to be limited in time, but if there are other questions, now is the time to unmute and get it off your chest. Let it go. If not, then I'll just thank you so much for this work you've done. And this kind of, I feel like it gives us a platform of information on which we can move forward. And, between learning about fungi being, the third leg of that tripod of life, and iNaturalist and how we might promote it. This was very, very helpful. So we appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for participating from wherever you may be.